The purpose of this lecture, as with the remaining lectures throughout this course, is to make sure we start off each new topic area by giving you a quick review over the salient features of the particular organ system we're covering. So because the topic this week is nervous system disorders, I wanted this first lecture to just be a very fast tour of the nervous system to remind you of important critical pieces of information we may refer back to. If you've had Bio 202 relatively recently, this will sound very familiar. If it's been a while since you had Bio 202, it may seem like I'm talking quickly, but you can always hit pause and take notes if you need to. Now, to remember with the nervous system, the nervous system is divided into two parts, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system, and I'll show you a picture of that in just a moment. But if we look at nervous system tissue, there are two basic types of cells found in nervous tissue. There are neurons. Those are the excitable cells that have the ability to receive incoming information and to send outgoing signals in the form of something we call an action potential. And neurons have some classic parts to them. If I were to draw just sort of a general neuron here, this middle part where the nucleus is called the soma. The branch-like projections over here are called the dendrites, and they are where incoming signals arrive at the neuron. And if an outgoing signal or action potential is required, it travels along this long process here called the axon. Now, the other type of cell found in nervous tissue are glial cells, also sometimes called neuroglial cells. These account for about 90% of all of the cells that are found in the nervous system. They are far, far more common than neurons. They also happen to be usually much smaller than neurons. Now, there are different types of glial cells depending on which portion of the nervous system we're looking at. If we're looking at the central nervous system, which includes the brain and spinal cord, there are four main types of glial cells found there. Oligodendrocytes, which I'm trying to look here in this picture, and they're not showing me oligodendrocytes. I think they're trying to make these look like oligodendrocytes, but they didn't do a very good job. Oligodendrocytes have these long projections that reach out to different axons and wrap around them to form myelin sheaths. And you'll remember myelin sheaths are made primarily of phospholipids, and they are there to help sort of, in a way, insulate an axon. They help to promote more rapid transmission of an action potential along an axon. One oligodendrocyte can have multiple processes, each process wrapped around a different axon. Astrocytes are these guys right up here, and astrocytes are support cells for the neurons. They do a number of different things. They perform cleanup activities around the neurons so that metabolic wastes are removed from around the neurons so they're not toxic or an irritant, and so that they don't impact neuronal ability to fire. They also form connections with the capillary, as you can see here, and those connections that they form with the capillary actually encourages the capillary cells to maintain very tight junctions between the simple squamous epithelial cells of the capillary, and that thus helps to promote a very tight blood-brain barrier so that toxins don't escape from the blood and enter into the brain tissue. The microglia are basically like the macrophages of the central nervous system. So they function as sort of cleanup activities for cellular debris or for bacterial infection, etc. And the ependymal cells are what line things like the choroid plexus and the ventricles, and they are responsible for the manufacture of cerebrospinal fluid. In the peripheral nervous system, there are two main types of glial cells. There are what are called satellite cells, and in this picture here, although it's very tiny, I hope you can see all these little tiny dots. Those are all the nuclei of satellite cells surrounding that central neuron. It's not clearly understood what the role of satellite cells is in the peripheral nervous system, but we do understand the role of the other main type of cell found in the peripheral nervous system called Schwann cells. Schwann cells are these guys right here that form these, almost look like beads on a piece of thread. They wrap themselves around an axon only axons, and they provide an insulative quality through the production of myelin sheaths, so they help promote faster transmission. So they are very similar to oligodendrocytes of the central nervous system, but the primary difference is one oligodendrocyte can have myelin sheaths around multiple axons of multiple neurons, whereas Schwann cells, one Schwann cell wraps itself around only one axon, and that's it. So each of these here that I'm circling is a separate Schwann cell that is in its entirety wrapped around that axon. I know I'm talking fast, but I got to try and cover a lot of basics here real quick just to refresh you on the key points here. Now, one thing that you learned in 202 was that neurons communicate with other neurons or with effector or target organs like glands, smooth muscle tissue, cardiac tissue via these connections called synapses, or a synapse is singular. And synapse can be of one of two types. They can be what's called a chemical synapse, and that involves the release of a neurotransmitter, and those are the most common. There's also a much less common type called an electrical synapse, where there's actual gap junctions connecting one neuron to the target cell, so you get direct transmission, very rapid transmission of a signal, but because you don't have the opportunity to send neurotransmitters, you can't modulate the meaning of the signal. Now let's take a look at a chemical synapse. That's the example you see down here. In a chemical synapse, there is always a very tiny space between the target cell, down here in yellow, and the presynaptic neuron here. That space between the two is called the synaptic cleft. And it is across that cleft or space that neurotransmitters must travel from the presynaptic neuron to reach either what's called the postsynaptic neuron or the target organ, such as a skeletal muscle cell. And once neurotransmitters are released from vesicles inside the axon terminal here, they diffuse across the cleft and they bind with their particular receptor proteins on the surface of the receiving cell. That's the synapse, very quickly. Now, I told you that the nervous system is divided into two main components. Those include the central nervous system here on the left in blue and the peripheral nervous system on the right in red. The central nervous system consists of two parts, the brain and the spinal cord. We're going to be focusing a lot of our discussions of central nervous system disorders on, much of our discussion on nervous system disorders, particularly on the central nervous system. On the other side here in the peripheral nervous system, there are two divisions, a sensory division, which is often called the afferent division because it receives information from the environment and carries it towards the central nervous system via the spinal cord towards the brain. And there's the motor division, which is also called the efferent division. Efferent is for signals exiting the brain and spinal cord and going out to a target organ to control some sort of motor response, be it contraction of a skeletal muscle, contraction of cardiac muscle, secretion from a gland, etc. Within the afferent division, there are two subdivisions. In other words, there are two places from which we can receive information, sensory information, and then transmit it towards the central nervous system. We can get sensory information from our external environment, such as from our eyes, our ears, our tongue, our sense of touch in the skin. Those are all conveyed by the somatic sensory division. On the other hand, we can also get information about our internal environment, and that occurs via collection through neurons in the visceral sensory division. So information about, say, how much your stomach is stretched after a meal, your heart rate, how full the bladder is, etc. That would be conveyed as sensory information from the visceral division. Now over here on the motor division, or the efferent division, we have two places that we can send outgoing signals to, and they happen to be the same two places from which we received information. They include the somatic motor division, and this is where we send information out to skeletal muscle to tell them to contract, and that's typically under voluntary control. Or we can send outgoing signals to the visceral motor division. This is to our internal organs, things like smooth muscle tissue, cardiac tissue, glands, for the promotion of secretions, etc. And this is typically not under conscious control. It tends to be involuntarily controlled. And we can further divide the visceral motor division into two subdivisions called the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. You'll remember the sympathetic nervous system is all about that fight or flight response. And that's mediated through the release of adrenaline, or what's called epinephrine. And the parasympathetic division, which I like to call the feed or breed part of the nervous system, this controls activities that are usually more activities that occur when you're in sort of a relaxed state, things like digesting your food, elimination of waste from the body, reproductive activity, etc. Now, let's take a quick look at the central nervous system. We're going to look at the brain first and then briefly look at the spinal cord. And the brain, you'll remember, is composed of a number of different discrete regions. There's the cerebral cortex, which is the outer layer of gray tissue where all the somas of the neurons are located, and that's divided into 5 lobes, the cerebral cortex. And those 5 lobes are the frontal lobe. Oops, I didn't quite draw that big enough, did I? The frontal lobe, all the way back to here, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe. Frontal lobe, the 5th lobe, which you cannot see from the exterior, is located deep, and it's about in this region right here, and that's called the insula. And the job of the insula is really not clearly understood or known, so it's normally just mentioned in passing and then not much more said about it. Now, the frontal lobe out here is what I like to call the executive brain, because its job is to be the decision maker for your brain. It weighs and evaluates information. It decides which particular strategy is the best. It's used for judgment, judging whether something's ethical and moral or not ethical and moral. It helps you decide how you're feeling about something. So it helps mediate emotions. It helps mediate aggression and social judgment. All of those kind of executive capacities are orchestrated by the frontal lobe. By comparison, the parietal lobe back here is primarily concerned with somatosensory information. It's all about receiving all of that sensory information from throughout the body, either visceral or somatic, and evaluating, weighing, and integrating that information. The temporal lobe, its principal job is hearing, but it is also implicated in things like smell and in recognition of objects. So if you see an object on a table and it's red and it's round and it has a stem on it, you're able to take all those pieces of information, and it's thanks to the temporal lobe that you're able to decide, oh, the word for that object is apple. The occipital lobe back here is your primary vision center. That's its main duty, is to orchestrate the process of vision. So it's taking incoming information from the eyes and processing that information and then sending signals forward to the cerebral cortex, other regions like the frontal lobe, so that you can decide what to do with that incoming visual information. Now, I erased all that, so I have a little bit of room here to move. There's 2 regions here I want to remind you about again, and that they are on either side of the central sulcus, or the central canal or groove, if you will, of the brain. And on the front side here, the anterior side, is what's called the precentral gyrus. On the back is the postcentral gyrus. The postcentral gyrus receives sensory information from the body, processes it, and this is part of the parietal lobe, so that should make sense. And then it sends that information forward to the precentral gyrus, which is in the frontal lobe, and the precentral gyrus determines what sort of motor output signal should be sent to which parts of the body to respond to that sensory information. You'll remember that there are these things called Wernicke's area and Broca's area. Wernicke's area is located right back in here. Its job is to help you to recognize the written or spoken word. So it deals with language, written or spoken. Broca's area up front here in the frontal lobe is concerned with helping you formulate language. So it's how, writing out the word or speaking the word. Broca's area helps with motor speech, whereas Wernicke's area is about sensory incoming information about language. Down here, this odd-shaped structure right here is called the cerebellum, which means little cerebrum. And the cerebellum is responsible for orchestrating things like repetitive motor movements like walking. It's also involved in equilibrium and other types of basic motor output. Below that here, and I'm going to move over to this other diagram, we have, if we cut the brain in half with a mid-sagittal cut, we can see in the center here we have a number of different structures, including the corpus callosum here, which is a region of tissue that connects the left and right hemispheres with one another so that the left side of the brain knows what the right side of the brain is doing and vice versa. Below that is a region in here I'm coloring called the thalamus. The thalamus is often called the gateway to the cerebral cortex. So all information coming from lower brain areas first travels through the thalamus and then it spreads out to the appropriate regions of the cerebrum for further processing. The hypothalamus, you'll remember, is this region right here below the thalamus. And the hypothalamus is all about homeostatic set points. It helps to regulate, for example, heart rate, breathing rate, helps to regulate it. It's not the only one involved. The medulla oblongata also comes into play. Hypothalamus also is responsible for encouraging the secretion of many different hormones from the anterior and the posterior pituitary. And the epithalamus back here is also another part of the brain you might remember is called the pineal gland also. And the pineal gland is what manufactures melatonin and thus helps orchestrate circadian rhythms. Here's that cerebellum again. And then we have a couple different regions here. We have the midbrain, which I'll outline in black here. Midbrain, right in this region, which is helps to transfer information back and forth between the cerebrum and the cerebellum, as does the pons right here, also helps with that. And the medulla oblongata down in here is the part of the brain that has those control centers like the cardiac center, the vasomotor center, the respiratory center. So it's involved in many reflexes that help control survival. I know that was a really, really super overview of the brain. I tried to go just fast. I just wanted to remind you of some of the key points and areas. Now let's take a very brief look at the covering of the brain, which is called the meninges. If you get infection of the meninges, you develop meningitis. The meninges are 3 layers of tissue that surround the brain as well as the spinal cord. And starting from the outside and working our way in, the first structure we have is called the dura mater, which literally means hard or tough mother. Mater means mother, and dura means hard or tough. This is a very leather-like tissue. It really does feel like leather if you ever get a chance to dissect a cadaver. You'll notice that it has a very thick feeling to it. Interior to that, or deep to that, is the next layer called the arachnoid mater. Arachnoid meaning web-like, spider-like, and you can even see that here in the arachnoid mater. You can see that it has a very web-like appearance. And then interior to that and wrapping itself immediately over the surface of the brain itself is the pia mater. Pia means gentle. If you ever took music classes, you'll know pianissimo, for example, means in Italian means very quietly. So this is a very quiet or gentle mother that just is a very thin layer that wraps around and protects the skull. Now we also have a number of different spaces in here, things like sinuses, dural sinuses, like the superior sagittal sinus here that's filled with cerebral spinal fluid. And we also have cerebral spinal fluid found in these things called ventricles. There are 4 ventricles in the brain. There are 2 what are called lateral ventricles. You have a left lateral and a right lateral ventricle. Inferior to that is a smaller opening called the third ventricle. You have only one of those. And inferior to that, and it's not even shown in this picture, is the 4th ventricle, which also contains cerebral spinal fluid. And you'll remember the job of cerebral spinal fluid is to give the brain buoyancy. So because the brain weighs quite a bit, but it's not very structurally sound. It doesn't have a lot of collagen, for example, in it. So it needs to be almost floating inside the skull so that we prevent the neurons that are near the base of the skull by being literally crushed from the weight above them. So buoyancy is one of the major things of the cerebral spinal fluid. Protection is another from impact and hard blows, which we'll be talking about in class. All right. Last thing to talk about here, oh, I guess not the last thing, we have 2 slides left, hang with me. I wanted to briefly remind you about the pieces and parts of the spinal cord. Just like the brain has an outer gray matter and an inner white matter, there's a gray and white matter in the spinal cord, but it's located in opposite regions. In the brain, the gray matter is where all the soma are, and it's on the outside or the superficial surface of the brain. The white matter is where all of the myelinated axons are, and it is deep in the brain. If we look at the spinal cord down here, and I apologize, I know the picture's a little small, but it will get the idea across. The darker region in here, inside the middle of the spinal cord here that looks a little like a butterfly, that's the gray matter. And surrounding it on the outside is the white matter. So the disbursement of white and gray matter in the spinal cord and brain are opposite of one another. The spinal cord has nerves that arise from it that called spinal nerves. Their job is to receive incoming sensory information and shuttle it to the brain, and to take information from the brain via the spinal cord and shuttle it out along effector nerves to target organs. Decussation often happens, or crossing over from the left to the right, decussation, in the spinal cord. And you'll remember that incoming sensory information into the spinal cord always comes in along the dorsal root of the spinal nerve, that's on the back side, and outgoing motor information is sent out along the ventral root of the spinal nerve. Now this is very similar to what we saw in the brain. If you remember back here, we said that sensory information comes in the post-central gyrus, in the post-central gyrus, that's near the back, and then motor information is sent out from region forward to that. Same thing in the spinal cord. We receive sensory information, it comes in the dorsal portion, the back portion. Outgoing motor information travels along the ventral portion. Last thing I want to talk about extremely briefly is the autonomic nervous system, which is your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system is pictured here on the left-hand side, and the characteristic features of the sympathetic nervous system are that it's often also called the thoraco-lumbar division, because all of the spinal nerves that send signals out from the sympathetic nervous system arise from the thoracic and lumbar regions of the spinal cord, as you can see here. And they travel immediately a very short distance. The presynaptic axon length is very short, to a region of ganglia that are called the paravertebral ganglia. And you'll remember that that paravertebral ganglia assists in dispersing the signal out from one spinal nerve, both up and down the paravertebral ganglia, so that we can hit multiple organs very rapidly. And this is why the sympathetic nervous system is called that. Sympathetic means, sym means with, together. Patho means feeling. So literally we get everybody together experiencing or feeling the same thing or responding in the same way with the sympathetic nervous system. Sympathetic nervous system is characterized as very rapid response and diffuse or highly spread throughout the body. By comparison, the parasympathetic nervous system is also called the craniosacral division, because the nerves that send signals out from the parasympathetic division arise from cranial nerves, and there's 4 different cranial nerves, including the vagus nerve, which is probably the most important one. And they also arise from some nerves in the sacral region of the spinal cord. You'll notice in these that we don't have any kind of paravertebral ganglia, so we have really long presynaptic axons before they actually get to the point where they synapse with the next axon in the arc or pathway. What this allows for is the parasympathetic nervous system to be very explicit and specific about which organ it targets, rather than having a very diffuse, widespread effect like the sympathetic nervous system does. The parasympathetic nervous system can be much more directed and localized in which organs it targets for a signal. So things like the kidneys and digestion, etc., are very common orchestrated areas that are dominated by the parasympathetic division. Sympathetic division is dominated more by increasing blood flow to the brain, to the skeletal muscle, to the heart, to the lungs, all of the things that you would want to have in a heightened state during a fight or flight response, as opposed to in the parasympathetic nervous system, which I also like to call the feed or breed part of the nervous system. These are more activities that center around things that you do during downtime, like digesting food. That is plenty. Should give you a quick overview and reminder of some of the important details about the nervous system, and we're going to start looking at actual nervous system disorders in class.